For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on the gist, we're looking at the Australian and Indian Prime Ministers' virtual summit. Our guest today is Ambassador Anil. Wadhwa has been a former secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, and he's also the author of the CII Australia Economic Strategy Report. Ambassador, good to see you.
Good to see you, Amitabh.
Ambassador, again, this virtual summit, I mean, the actual one hasn't taken place for various reasons, but just before we get to discussing that, I just want to play out an excerpt of what Scott Morrison said about the current situation in Europe vis-a-vis the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the Quad focus on Indo-Pacific. This is what Scott Morrison had to say.
Today is, of course, set against a very distressing backdrop of the war in Europe, which must never happen in our own region. And I very much want to thank you for the partnership that we have. While we are obviously distressed at the terrible situation in Europe, our focus, of course, is always very much on what is occurring in the Indo-Pacific and ensuring that those events could never occur here in the Indo-Pacific. Our region is facing increasing change and much pressure, and I think our Quad leaders' call recently, which gave us the opportunity to discuss Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine, but it also gave us the opportunity to discuss the implications and consequences of that terrible event for our own region in the Indo-Pacific and the coercion and the issues that we face here. The tragic loss of life underlies the importance, of course, of holding Russia to account, but cooperation between like-minded liberal democracies is key to an open and inclusive and resilient and prosperous Indo-Pacific, and I welcome your leadership within the Quad to keeping us focused on those important issues.
Ambassador, within the Quad, of course, there are three US and two of its treaty allies. India's position on what's happening in Europe is nuanced and different. What's your reading in terms of, is there pressure for India to change its stance, or is there an understanding of India's position?
Look, I think what came out after the readout and from the briefing by the Foreign Secretary, it was quite clear that when Ukraine was discussed, it was also said by the Australian Prime Minister that Australia understands India's position, but at the same time would like to see India perhaps come out more strongly against what they view as a complete invasion by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. And I think that's the stance of the US treaty allies, both Japan and Australia, with whom we've had summit-level interactions over the past few days. They both stressed, similarly that India should be doing much more by way of condemnation of what is happening in Europe. But at the same time, I think there is an understanding about why India has taken this position and where India comes from.
Right. In terms of military and defense security cooperation between India and Australia bilaterally and within the Quad, that has also progressed quite a lot. I mean, in terms of the reciprocal agreements, we had Malabar, of course, we have other exercises that are continuing.
You're absolutely right, because it's a question of making progress incrementally. And in this case, by signing these interoperability agreements with Australia and with Japan, I think India has done quite well in terms of integration with the rest of the members of the Quad. Of course, the integration with the US has taken place over the past few years. But one particular issue of interest to viewers would be the fact that the Malabar exercises have grown in sophistication and in depth and in range. and also the fact that now all four Quad partners are part of the Malabar exercises. Submarine warfare and detection has been added. And I think with the addition of the space dimension to the Quad cooperation, that would strengthen maritime cooperation even further. Maritime domain awareness would be strengthened much more. So in that sense, I think the Quad partners, without actually doing something when the summit meetings take place, in practical terms, that cooperation on the defense side is progressing pretty well.
The other big pillar, of course, is economics, and you have a lot. You've been contributing a lot on that front. I just want to again now play out an excerpt of what Prime Minister Modi said in his opening remarks in that virtual summit when he was talking about CECA, the interim agreement that we are expecting, and economic cooperation. This is what Prime Minister Modi had to say.
Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement सीका, इस पर जैसा आपने कहा, मैं भी चाहता हूं कि बहुत कम समय में उल्लेखनीय प्रगति हुई है। मुझे पूरा विश्वास है कि बाकी बचे मुद्दों पर भी शीघ्र सहमति बन जाएगी। सीका का शीघ्र समापन हमारे आर्थिक संबंधों, इकोनॉमिक रिवाइवल और इकोनॉमिक सिक्योरिटी के लिए बहुत महत्वपूर्ण होगा। कोड में भी हमारे बीच अच्छा सहयोग चल रहा है। हमारा यह सहयोग फ्री, ओपन और इंक्लूसिव इंडो पैसिफिक के प्रति हमारी प्रतिबद्धता को दर्शाता है। क्षेत्रीय और वैश्विक स्थिरता के लिए क्वाड की सफलता बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है।
As in terms of the interim or early harvest deal, whatever you want to call it, there were timelines that officially had been laid out, or possibilities. Early it was September for the interim, then December, now it's end March, with, of course, the final agreement still staying in that end of this year timeline. The sticking points now, why does it take so long to negotiate? I mean, it's been pretty fast, but I'm saying, what are the sticking points? Is it agriculture, meat products, dairy products, imports from the US, from Australia, I beg your pardon, and Indian service exports or professional mobility? Are these the main sticking points?
Well, from all indications, Australia has been very generous in its offer as far as trade is concerned, and at least 97% of our trade is covered by their offer of zero tariffs. Now, starting from that point of view, obviously Australia would require some benefits out of this agreement as well. After all, it's a give and take in these negotiations. And naturally, India would be looking at giving concessions in areas where we already import, perhaps exclusively from Australia or to a large extent from Australia, because then our imports become that much cheaper by reduction of tariffs. So even if India does not reciprocate by way of zero tariffs, which perhaps it will not, but at the same time, it seems to be in a good position with this offer on the table. And as far as I know, that the Australians have also agreed to look at the services liberalization in a very effective manner because of the fact that there is a mutual dependency there, especially in terms of cybersecurity and IT technicians who are required in the Australian market, and also professionals who work in the Australian industries. So I think in terms of both goods and services, it seems to be a good offer to take. But obviously back home here in India, there would be certain sectors which we all know about. You mentioned dairy and agriculture, which are, of course, very sensitive subjects as far as India is concerned, but also some large ticket imports. Now, if you know, for example, India imports about 74% of its imports of coal for the steel industry from Australia. Obviously, because it's better to import it from there, Perhaps the prices are much better, and also at the same time, the thermal content in Australian coal is much higher. So all these factors make Australia a popular place to import from. But at the same time, I think there has to be some kind of duty imposed, because otherwise, the self-reliant nature of the Indian coal industry and the plans that the government has to increase coal production within the country would suffer. And similarly, India has a nascent wine industry, for instance. So that sector also needs to be catered to. So you can obviously look at niche areas for imports, but cannot open it up totally. So I'm just giving you a few examples to highlight the kind of problems that can arise in these negotiations. I'm not saying that these are the sticking points, because nobody knows what they are at the moment. But from all accounts, the positions are very close. And as you know, always in these negotiations, it's a whole package which goes together. So nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, and that's where we are at the moment.
Right. In terms of trade agreements, I mean, India has been talking about trade agreements for the near past. Just recently with the UAE, the interim agreement with Australia expected. I mean, UK, EU, Israel. There's so many in queue. Why is India focusing so much now on trade deals at this geopolitical moment, especially when, say, we pulled out of RCEP?
Well, you precisely pointed to the right reason, because since we are not in the RCEP, we have to open up with the others wherever we can. With the RCEP, of course, we have the cushion of having an FTA with ASEAN. So, and now with the CECA with Australia, the limited CECA with Australia, we will cover one more country. We already have trading arrangements, similar trading arrangements with Japan and Korea. So that leaves only China and New Zealand out. And I suppose once we have this in place, we will pretty much cover a large part of our trade with these countries in RCEP. But at the same time, in order to make sure that our imports become a little more cheaper, so that the inputs are cheaper into the economy and we can export much more of the products that we already are exporting to countries like UAE, UK, Canada, etc. We are looking at the limited CECA route, which will allow us to concentrate on goods and services. Goods, particularly in the range of those which are traded the most between these countries and India, and services, which is in any case our strength. And opening up of services would be of benefit generally to India. So this seems to be the thinking right now. And I think when the Indian economy gets more resilient in terms of the strengthening of the domestic industry through the PLI schemes and investments into the market from outside, then that would be the point to look at much larger groupings or agreements which India could enter into.
There's been significant movement, and if you could expand on that bilaterally, India and Australia, in terms of critical minerals or critical or technology. I mean, they're even setting up in Bangalore, right?
Yes. So that's a very, very important area of agreement. And in fact, Australia has just announced a $280 million worth of different segments of investments into the Indian economy, of which 35 or $36 million have been earmarked for a green steel partnership, for instance, a critical minerals research partnership, and also a contribution to the International Energy Agency to support cooperation on research, production, and commercialization of clean technologies, critical minerals, and energy. And of course, if you look at the joint statement between India and Australia, which has been issued after this summit, you see that both countries are very keen that there has to be some amount of investments from India into the Australian critical mineral sector. So the MOU on co-investments in Australian critical minerals projects between Khanit Videsh India Limited and the Critical Minerals Facilitation Office in Australia is extremely important from that point of view.
And there was also talk about giving reciprocity, though that wasn't the exact term used, and I'm sure there must be some legal reason for that in terms of pension fund investments in India getting the same uh, kind of rules as we were getting there. And in terms of investment, is what I'm asking.
Yes, it's no, it's about tax benefits because
Hmm.
investments made by Australia's sovereign and pension funds in India would now receive the same tax benefits as they receive in Australia. Now, obviously, when these funds invest in the Australian economy, the Australian organizations and the state governments in the state governments and the federal government encourage them to invest within Australia. So it makes it much more attractive for them not to go out in uncertain situations. But if they're offered the same kind of tax benefits, then makes them that much easier because of the higher returns which the Indian market offers, especially by way of investments in infrastructure. So this is the reason why, and as you know, for the past 2 to 3 years, India has been trying quite hard to attract these funds, the pension funds from Australia into the Indian economy. To a large extent, they have succeeded as well, but much more is needed, given the fact that the Indian infrastructure needs are huge. And in the coming years, Australian investment into Indian infrastructure can play a very big role in the development of Indian economy.
And these are huge corpuses, both these pension and sovereign funds. In terms of whether it's bilateral, whether it's trilateral, I mean, you have Australia, Indonesia, India, you have Australia, Japan, India. I presume Australia, France, India would be on the back burner post AUKUS. But if you want to just put in context the bilaterals, the trilaterals, and the Quad itself, and how they fit into our foreign policy interests.
So I think the Indian foreign policy now is on a multi-vector mode, if I may call that. So besides the bilateral engagement, we also have a number of trilaterals which are working quite well, and we have, of course, the Quad. So far, we haven't seen a much larger grouping, but at the same time, there are, there's the Quad Plus arrangement, which has happened at least in two sectors, especially in vaccine rollout, etc. And going forward, it will also happen in the telecom sector, for instance. The trilaterals that we have with Indonesia and Australia, and then we have Japan, the involvement of Japan in some, Australia in the other, United States in some of them. So all these are working pretty well on their own steam. And there was also a very important trilateral with France and Australia. Unfortunately, that has been stalled, as you know, because of the formation of AUKUS, at least for the time being. So we'll see how it goes in future. But so far, they proved very, very useful. And they're useful inputs then into the bilateral arrangements that we have. One particular trilateral arrangement that I'd like to pick up on is the Resilient Supply Chains Initiative. And that is between Australia and Japan and India. Now, of course, the direction it is taking is slightly different because it's going much more into the digital trade route, where liberalization of trade, and that seems to be the future of liberalization of trade, where countries like Japan and Australia and Singapore in the region have taken the lead. And India would do well to enter into similar arrangements with these countries, in order that the costs of doing trade with each other are brought down and there's more efficiency that can be brought into this process.
Since you're talking about digitization, there was also a talk during this summit about digital payments. I mean, our UPI versus not versus, but with the Australian system. How significant is that? I mean, there are attempts to do that in various other countries as well.
Yeah, that's also a growing trend, and India has been trying as much as possible to make the RuPay payment, for instance, acceptable to a number of countries. In terms of Australia, because it has a sizable Indian diaspora, So now at the moment we have 721,000 people at last count, and growing. And they would benefit from this arrangement. And then, of course, we will also benefit from the bilateral payments process. We've seen how the sanctions, for instance, in Ukraine have affected the world payment system. And when countries trade with each other and they have alternate arrangements, they always come in handy. Not that I'm saying that between India and Australia we might need different kinds of arrangements, but it's always useful to have diverse payment mechanisms, which make it that much easier to settle on a bilateral basis without paying those many commissions.
Master, if you want to wrap up your thoughts in terms of the significance of India-Australia bilateral relations within also the Quad and the current geopolitical scenario. I mean, the Quad, whether you say it or not publicly, I mean, it's Indo-Pacific, yes, but it is looking at China's aggression. Is the focus being shifted because of what is happening in Europe, in Russia and between Russia and Ukraine?
I think the focus will not shift. The only issue is that there are divergences of approach to the issue of Russia and Ukraine, but the dependency between India and Australia and the linkages, bilateral linkages, will continue to grow in the future. If you look at what has happened in the recent past, for instance, besides the two-way investment flows which are growing, we also have growing education ties. Going forward, when tourism opens up, that will offer immense possibilities of growth. And then, of course, we have the technology partnership with Australia, which is in particular the critical and emerging technologies. Space has opened up now. Defense companies will find further niche opportunities in each other. The health sector is a very promising sector. Australia looks at India as a big agribusiness partner. Resources will remain the center of our economic relationship. And of course, our energy ties are also growing along with financial services and technology services. So, the people to people links are increasing, mainly driven by the student community, which has grown in Australia. Of course, we had a hiatus year, so to speak, because of the pandemic. But I'm sure going forward, it will get revived again in future. And that people to people relationship and the diaspora presence in Australia will eventually drive this relationship much further.
Ambassador, again, absolutely appreciate your sharing your experience and your expertise here with us on StratNews Global with all our viewers.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. Pleasure.
Pleasure was ours. And thank you for all of the support that you're giving us. I mean, you've helped us get past that 100,000 subscriber mark, and we're looking to go much further. Do follow our social media handles. And if you want to support us financially, there is a link in the YouTube descriptor. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.